Hi, I'm Derrick Jensen. This is Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network. My guest today is Dr. Sherri Mason, who goes by Sam. She became obsessed with the impacts of humans on the environment when, at the age of 11, she watched a very poignant Different Strokes episode in which Kimberly's hair turned green after washing it with acid rain. While not scientifically accurate, the episode made an impact and set Dr. Mason's path as an environmental chemist. She earned her bachelor's degree from the University of Texas at Austin before moving on to her PhD from the University of Montana as a NASA Earth System Science Scholar. She's currently a full professor in chemistry at the State University of New York at Fredonia. We're going to talk about the Great Lakes. So first, thank you for your work, and thank you for being on the program.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
And so tell me about the Great Lakes.
Oh, wow, the Great Lakes. I'm, as you kind of said in your intro, I'm originally from Texas, and then I lived in Montana. And I moved to the Great Lakes region, upstate New York. I live along the shores of Lake Erie back in 2001. And I lived along the shores of Lake Erie for 10 years before I actually ever went out in the water. Um, and there's a reason for that. And people who live along the shores of Lake Erie will know why, because Lake Erie, being the smallest and shallowest of the Great Lakes, is also the warmest, which means we have a lot of life in Lake Erie, and it washes up along the shorelines as it dies, which is not, I guess, that doesn't make me laugh. It's the fact that, when you walk along the beach, then what you see is a bunch of dead algae and a bunch of dead fish, which is not very pleasant. And I also grew up reading Dr. Seuss, and Dr. Seuss makes his comment in the Lorax about things are almost as bad as Lake Erie. And so kind of my perception of the Great Lakes living along the shores for the first 10 years that I lived here was that the Great Lakes were dirty and gross and filthy and contaminated. And I guess in many ways, all of that is true. We have huge algal blooms that happen in the summer. We do have botulism, which leads to the dead bird and dead fish carcasses that we see washing up on the shores. But my impression now of the Great Lakes, since I started sailing them back in 2011, has completely shifted. We have all of these problems, but they are breathtakingly gorgeous. I start to get actually really teary thinking about, because I've now sailed all 5 of the Great Lakes. I've swam in all 5 of the Great Lakes. And I think, if talking about them to other people, what's really kind of important to realize is just really how gorgeous they are. They're the largest freshwater ecosystem in the world, which is something that's really easy to not even appreciate, even when you're living along the shores. But it's important. They're huge, vast network of freshwater. There's so much life in them, and they're just so beautiful. This time of year, you can find all sorts of images of the frozen Great Lakes making their way through the various avenues of the internet, and I encourage people to go seek those images out, because they really do help to kind of cement into one's mind how gorgeous they really are. So is that a good starting point?
Oh, that's great. So do we have one of the things that's always very interesting to me is sort of establishing baselines and thinking about, like, when I read about there were flocks of passenger pigeons so large that they darkened the sky for days at a time. Or I live out in the Pacific Northwest, and so the baseline here is that prior to conquest there was a grizzly bear every 15 minutes. You'd see one if you were sitting by a stream. And the runs of salmon were so large that you could hear them for miles before you'd see them. And do we know anything about the prior fecundity of the Great Lakes? And then, if so, how has that translated to the present?
It's a good question. One of the things that the Great Lakes became famous for is their fishing. They're still well known for their fishing, but the fish, the type of fish that we have is completely transformed. Where now it's stocked fish, and it's Whereas the native fish species, a lot of them have died off in part because of overfishing. Along the shores, this region originally became famous because of the mink population, which is something I read about. And I had no knowledge living here that minks were native to this area. But again, basically overuse of that species for mink coats led to their demise, and they no longer exist here. And you do have similar stories with regard to, you were talking about the salmon and the fish, steelhead on their way up to give birth, do the same thing, where the runs of the steelhead up the streams along the lakes it could be so massive that you wouldn't see water. All you would see is fish. So we have quite a legacy but it dates so far back that I think a lot of it isn't discussed as much. This is one of the kind of first areas of the United States that became industrialized, and we used back in that time the mentality of us as a people was that we couldn't possibly cut down enough trees to do any damage. We couldn't possibly, add enough chemicals to the air and to the water to do any damage. The solution to pollution is dilution. And so our kind of industrial legacy is more the remnants and more what you hear about people talking about nowadays. It's more kind of the mentality actually of this area.
So could we talk about what is your focus of work on the Great Lakes?
Yeah, so I moved here, I mentioned in 2001, and at the time I was an atmospheric chemist, so I studied emissions of combustion into the atmosphere, and actually started with forest fires, having come from Montana, but moved out here and started looking at more like car and industrial emissions. And then I went out on I took over the environmental sciences program here at Fredonia, and I started co-teaching a course with a colleague of mine at Niagara University aboard a tall ship, the U.S. brig Niagara. It's gorgeous War of 1812 vessel. Something, picture Pirates of the Caribbean, a boat like that is just gorgeous, all wooden, double-masted, square-rigged, tall ship. And we started teaching an environmental science course aboard that vessel in 2011. And when I was on board, my intention was to talk about how the main contributors of chemicals into the Great Lakes nowadays is coming from above. It's coming from the air. But while I was out there, I was just watching the water go past the boat, and I was thinking about everything that I had heard and read and seen and taught about what has been termed the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, right? This collection of mostly plastic debris in the North Pacific Ocean. And just had a really simple question come into my mind, and I wondered, I wonder if there's plastic in the Great Lakes. And that's the way science, or what I love about science, is that it can start with something so simple. It seemed like such an obvious question to me when I asked it. I was like, I came back to shore and I just immediately started doing a literature review, because it was mostly that I was interested in finding out what was already known. Because I teach a non-majors chemistry class where I like to use examples like that, things that are very real and connected to students who aren't chemistry majors. And plastic is a great material to do that with. So I was looking in the literature, looking for something, and was really amazed that I couldn't find anything. So here, I'd been teaching about plastics in the oceans for 10 years at that point. And the story that I and other people like me had been telling, because, what we find in the oceans, we know from the United Nations, 80% of what we find in the ocean comes from land. So basically the story that we tell is that plastic bag you've seen blowing in the wind, well, that makes its way into a river, and that flows into a lake, and eventually those lakes will flow into the ocean. And, so what we find then in the ocean is ultimately connected to what we do here on the land. And basically the story that we tell is that plastic makes its way through freshwater systems. And what I realized in 2011 is that while we've been telling that story and talking about it, nobody had been looking in freshwater systems for plastic. And that, again, as a scientist, is very interesting and very kind of exciting in a not very, we're very kind of conflicted in my research group. We never know if we're happy that we find plastic or sad, because we really don't want to find it. But it's interesting when you do find it. So, so that's led us in 2012. Basically, my research group completely changed direction, and we went from studying air pollution to studying water pollution. And we took a very fine mesh net. Basically, for your listeners, you could imagine a wedding veil. That's about the same mesh size as the net that we use in the water. It's 333 microns, so a third of a millimeter. And we drag it through the water. And then, we basically collect anything that's bigger than a third of a millimeter. So it's not just that we collect plastic. I think this is a very important point to make, because we collect vascular plants, we collect bugs, so many bugs. I can't believe how many bugs are in the middle of the Great Lakes. We collect algae and plankton and all sorts of stuff, but mixed in with all of that life is plastic. Really, really small pieces of plastic, in fact. So we started that study in 2012. We sailed Lake Superior, which flows into Lake Huron, and then that flows into Lake Erie. So we studied those three Great Lakes. And basically the intention at that point was just to answer that very fundamental question: is there plastic within the Great Lakes? And then based upon the results of that study, we went back in 2013 and we studied, we did a second survey of Lake Erie. We did Lake Ontario, which is Lake Erie flows into Lake Ontario, and then Lake Ontario flows out the St. Lawrence Seaway to the North Atlantic Ocean. So we did Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and Lake Michigan, the last of the Great Lakes, all within 2013. So at this point, between 2012 and 2013, we've surveyed all 5 of the Great Lakes for plastic pollution. So,
and what sort of what are you finding?
Yeah, so I mean, I think this is really interesting. Having taught and studied, and researched basically what other people have been doing in the oceans, the majority of what we find in the oceans is about 1 to 5 millimeters. That's typically the size of the plastic that we find in the oceans. The majority of it. I mean, we find things that are bigger than that. We find things that are smaller than that. But about 50 to 60% is within that size classification. But what we're finding, and so looking in the Great Lakes, which essentially are upstream from the oceans, what we really expected to find were bigger plastic items. I thought we would be pulling in bags and bottles and Barbie dolls. But instead, what we've been finding are actually a lot very, very small particles. So 80% of the plastic that we pull in is less than 1 millimeter in size. And so that in and of itself is very interesting, is just how incredibly tiny the plastic is, which begs the question as to why. And we have some ideas as to that. We can talk about that. But it also, kind of, what are the sources of these plastics? And then where are the plastics going? So in terms of sourcing of plastics is always the hardest thing. With regard to plastic pollution, this is kind of the I don't know. It's our Achilles heel, I guess, for the most part, is trying to figure out where the plastic is coming from. We were able, because a lot of the plastic that we found was so small and perfectly round, spherical, colored balls of plastic, that really kind of helped us at least identify one probably definitely significant, but potentially, very significant source of plastic that we were finding. And that led us to looking at these personal care products that include microbeads. So you'll see them on the store shelves. I mean, if all of our listeners could maybe picture walking around a grocery store right now, walking down an aisle where there's, soaps and shampoos, and you're looking at the products and you see these clear bottles with a clear gel, and kind of suspended within this clear gel are these colored balls of plastic. And maybe you didn't realize they were plastic. That's what most people tell me. They're like, I didn't know that was plastic. You'll see them advertised on TV. Jennifer Gardner is advertising one right now from Neutrogena. It has little polka dots all over the the screen, and talking about these micro beads abrading the skin and helping to exfoliate. And so they're very kind of enticing from a marketing standpoint. But as I said, most people didn't realize that those little balls are actually plastic. And so they wash down the drain, and we've been looking in wastewater treatment plants and verifying that they wash down the drain, they make their way through the wastewater treatment plant process, and then they're discharged into a nearby body of water. And then when we, go sampling in the Great Lakes, we find hundreds of thousands of these little balls of plastic, just, suspended within the water. So that's like one source. It's not the only source, but it's one pretty good identifiable source of the plastic that we're seeing. And then, we go to the other end of the question, the other end of the spectrum with, what happens to those plastics? And what's really concerning about the fact that the plastics are so small is the fact that the smaller the piece of plastic, the more easily it's ingested by living organisms. So, I mentioned when we're bringing in our nets, the Great Lakes are so alive. That's one of the beauties of the Great Lakes is of any freshwater system is how alive it is. It's what we love about them, all the fish and the birds and the, plants and the, they're just really these alive, gorgeous organisms, ecosystems. And so you have these little balls of plastic suspended in this, and they look like fish food. So we've started looking at fish. We've analyzed 17 different species of fish out of Lake Erie, and one waterfowl, so one bird that eats fish, the double-crested cormorant. And we're looking within their gastrointestinal tracts, and we're finding all of these little pieces of plastic within the fish.
So we've heard that in the oceans there can be in places 6 to 10 times as much plastic as phytoplankton. And are you seeing high concentrations like that? Because you've said it's there, but you haven't really talked about concentration yet.
That's good point. We find, so it depends upon which Great Lake that you look at. So I already mentioned the flow of the water. Lake Superior flows into Lake Huron. Some of that water is diverted into Lake Michigan. Lake Michigan is kind of its own beast because it's at the same height as Lake Huron, so the water doesn't have much reason to flow out of Lake Michigan. So we if we're following the flow of water, we would start Lake Superior, Lake Huron, Lake Erie, Lake Ontario, and then out the St. Lawrence Seaway to the Atlantic Ocean. And as we follow the flow of water, the counts are increasing. So Lake Superior, on average, we're finding something like 8,000 particles of plastic per square kilometer. Very comparable on Lake Huron, 8 to 10,000. We get to Lake Erie, though, the counts, Lake Erie is of all of the Great Lakes, Lake Erie is the most densely populated. It's the shallowest, so the water goes through there the fastest. And looking on average within Lake Erie, the counts go from 10,000 in Lake Huron. In Lake Erie, they're more like 80,000 on average. And we've had counts as high as 460,000 plastic particles per square kilometer. In square miles, that would be 1.1 million plastic particles per square mile. So, and that's comparable to what you're seeing in the oceans. So when you get into Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, it blows Lake Erie out of the water. The counts there average more like 500,000 plastic particles per square kilometer. And we had one sampled there, that was 1.3 million plastic particles per square kilometer. And so the counts within Lake Erie and Lake Ontario are very comparable, and in some cases higher than what we see in the world's oceans. So very high counts of very, very small particles.
So I want to ask you more in a moment about the effects of this, but before I do that, I want to ask about your use of the word square as opposed to cubic, in that how far down the water column do you think that this goes?
That's a good point. Yeah, we look at surface areas here because plastics typically either float or they sink. And you might get a little mixing down because mostly of wind action, but we tend to do it in areas as opposed to volumes. Our net only goes about 10 centimeters below the surface, so we really are like skimming along the surface of the water. And you don't have a lot, kind of mixing down the entire water column. And then you might kind of go, well, what about, you said that some of it sinks. In theory, everything that we're seeing on the surface of the water is mirrored on the sediment. But people have just started looking at the sediment. In fact, there's only been one study that came out so far from the St. Lawrence Seaway. And the counts actually there would kind of indicate that actually we might be seeing more in the sediment than we are on the surface, which is scary.
So can you talk about some of the potential effects? You mentioned this can be confused for fish food, and you've said that it ends up in their gastrointestinal systems. And one of the ways I've thought about this with plankton is just the notion of, if there are 6 to 10 times as much plastic as phytoplankton, that'd be like out of every 10 bites you take, 9 of them are plastic, and this would obviously create some problems.
Yeah, the biggest concern with plastic is not really the plastic itself, it's the chemicals. So when we make plastics, plastic is, one of the things that makes plastic such an amazing material from a chemistry standpoint is the fact that it's a very sturdy material, very stable. And so in order to make it moldable, we add plasticizers to it. And BPA is probably the most infamous of all the plasticizers, right? Being affiliated with, it's an estrogen mimic, as many plasticizers are. And so you're right, it's been banned from baby bottles, but not banned from use at all. And a recent study came out showing that the replacement for BPA is just as bad, if not worse, than BPA itself. So we incorporate these plasticizers, and it's not like they make up a minor component, and sometimes the plasticizers are more of the chemical composition of the plastic than the plastic is. They're anywhere from 30 to 70% of the overall mass of plastic would be plasticizers. So you have these chemicals that we embed within the plastic, and while they're there, they're not chemically bound to the plastic. So the thing is that they can then leach out of the plastic. Another example is flame retardants. I'm not sure why we're very concerned that our plastics are going to catch on fire, but apparently we are. And so we embed flame retardants within the plastics. And again, those can then leach out. So you have that. But then in addition to that, when the plastic is sitting in water, you have the ability for the plastics to adsorb chemicals out of the water. So chemicals will actually stick onto the surface, basically, of the plastic. And this is very important in the Great Lakes because I already kind of mentioned the industrial legacy that the Great Lakes have. So we know, for examples, that polychlorinated biphenyls, PCBs, have elevated concentrations in the Great Lakes. They were banned in the 1970s, but these are a group of chemicals that are what we call persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic, PBTs. And by persistent, we mean they were banned in the 70s, and here it is, 2015, and we still find them in the water. PEHs are another group of compounds, polyaromatic hydrocarbons. They're produced most notably from coal-fired power plants, and we have lots of those up here. So they're produced, they go out the smokestack, and then they'll settle down into the water. And while you find these chemicals in the water, they don't really like being in water. They're what, as a chemist, I would refer to as hydrophobic, so water-fearing molecules. And so while they're in the water, they don't really want to be there. And so when there's a piece of plastic around that can offer them a surface to get out of the water, they'll migrate onto it. And studies within the world's oceans have actually shown that the amount of chemicals on the surface of a piece of plastic can be 1,000,000 times greater than what's in the surrounding waters. And so basically then the plastic becomes like a little chemical sponge, if you will, while it's sitting in the water. And then that plastic, as you said, looks like food, so then it gets ingested. And it can be ingested by fish. It could be ingested by filter feeders. Plastics are so small that plankton could be eating these plastics. Just as they filter water through their bodies, these plastics would come in and basically be ingested. And then a fish eats the plankton, and then a bigger fish eats the smaller fish, right? And then these plastics can move up the food chain. And all along that time, those chemicals that are on the plastic can be moving off of the plastic and into the fatty tissues of those organisms. And all of these chemicals, I mean, whether you're talking about the BPA, the plasticizers, the PCBs, the PHs, all of these are known to be carcinogenic, mutanogens, teratogens, endocrine disruptors, you name it, they do it, and none of it's good.
So something that's always really fascinated me is the process of decay and watching things fall apart. And like, I live in a redwood forest, and I love watching, we had big storms, and just had a big storm 2 days ago, and the top of one tree fell off. And so I'm going to have just a fabulous time over the next 3 years watching the next 15 years probably, watching the aftermath of this as I watch that tree slowly settle into the soil. And that all makes me happy. And then at the same time, I think about this with various toxins. I kind of like watching things rust away too. And so how a lot of these are a lot of these pollutants that are in there forever that you mentioned, or that have been put into the Great Lakes, do they have any sort of half-life in less than geologic terms, in terms of somehow breaking down into less carcinogenic or less toxic materials? Let's step away from the plastic for a second. We can talk about that again in a second. But some of these toxic chemicals you mentioned, do they eventually break down, or are they basically in the Great Lakes forever?
No, they do eventually break down. It's just that the time scale for that, as you mentioned, the half-life, are on the orders of decades as opposed to, minutes. And so, so like the PCBs, the counts, the concentrations of those within the water, because they have been banned as a result of Silent Spring, actually. So because they have been banned, their concentrations are declining within the Great Lakes. They're just still present. And
their concentrations are increasing in the plastic part.
We don't really know, because nobody had been looking at plastics, and so having a timeline on all the plastic counts increasing, likely yes, because there was a time that plastics didn't exist. So yeah, since World War II, basically you would anticipate that the plastics have been increasing, and then we'll have to see what happens.
Oh no, I'm sorry, I wasn't clear. I was trying to say that because the plastics are accumulators of the toxins, that even if the toxins are going down in general, because of that half-life of the PCBs, that they would be then accumulating around the plastics themselves.
Right, and they'll absorb onto the surface of the plastic, which can actually enhance then what we find in the water, right? We do know that the concentrations of PCBs, PHs, are pretty steady. That's because we still burn coal, So their concentrations within the Great Lakes are fairly constant. So they're always being added to the Great Lakes, and so they're always present. And so then they would be, basically perpetually adsorbing onto any plastic that is present. But yeah, I mean, all of these chemicals, they do have half-lives. They do have, the ability to decompose into less toxic forms. It's just that the length of time required for that is greater than the time frame for which they can start having an impact on the organisms that live in that water, right?
Right. So what about the plastic itself? I wrote a book years ago, What We Leave Behind, that talks extensively about plastic because the stuff is just an extraordinary creation in terms of, it's made not to decompose essentially.
Right. Yeah.
And so what if humans if nobody did anything to clean it up, what happens to the plastic?
So plastic doesn't biodegrade. So, you leave a piece of paper, you're talking about the redwood, right, outside, and there are organisms within the soil that can decompose that material. I mean, if we're talking about a piece of paper or the redwood, that's made out of a polymer, which a plastic is a synthetic polymer, right? Or the redwood tree, a piece of paper, those are natural polymers, cellulose, right? So in both cases, whether we're talking about a redwood or a piece of plastic, they're both fundamentally made from what a chemist would refer to as a polymer or a repeating chain. Think of a train made up of cars that repeat, right? So you have this long train, and there are organisms in the soil that can decompose that train back into the cars that make up the train. And they're really good because, basically they've adapted. They're really good at doing this with natural polymers, so like the redwood. But synthetic polymers, man-made, there aren't very many. There's a few species that can decompose synthetic polymers, but largely we refer to them as being non-biodegradable because of the fact that the number of organisms that can use plastics as a food source is so incredibly small. So they don't biodegrade. Instead, they undergo what's called a photodegradation process, where basically the action of sunlight will weaken the links in the molecule, and then the action of wind and water hitting on that plastic will cause it to break into smaller and smaller pieces. But while it's breaking into smaller and smaller pieces, the molecular integrity of the plastic doesn't really change all that much. So basically, we're separating one molecule from another molecule, but we're not making the molecule itself any smaller. Not significantly. It'll start on the edges, and over hundreds of years it can work to get smaller. But it's a very long process, and this is why, again, we don't say that plastics biodegrade. We say they photodegrade, and basically the point is that they get smaller and smaller, but they maintain their molecular integrity. They stay a plastic. They stay a synthetic polymer. They just get smaller and smaller. So they're very resistant to that kind of natural decomposition. What would happen to them eventually? I mean, we don't really know. I mean, the plastics have really only been on the marketplace since World War II. In any significant form. They were, the infrastructure for the mass manufacture of plastics happened during World War II. And it was after World War II that, the attention turned from the military industrial complex to the consumer, and changed kind of the landscape of our society as a result of that. But, and because basically they don't biodegrade, it's stated that every piece of plastic that we've ever manufactured is on this planet somewhere. And what we're realizing more and more is that it's in our water. A significant fraction of it is within our water. And what does that mean for us? What does that mean for, anything that lives in the water, that relies on water?
I keep thinking about a line that I heard decades ago now. It was said by somebody after Bhopal, with the massive pesticide explosion that killed, immediately killed like 8 to 10,000 people, and has probably killed hundreds of thousands or 100,000 since. That one of the people in the aftermath said that no one should be allowed to make a poison for which there is no antidote. And that has always struck me as one of the smartest lines that any human has ever said. And I think about that in terms of plastic too, that I know it's kind of useless to wish that somebody had done something different, but it seems to me that it's just not a very smart idea to create a substance that doesn't decompose, that isn't
Right.
food for someone.
Yeah. I mean, I understand that as we grow as a species, like any infant, right? We're growing up and we become smarter with age. But I get very frustrated at the prevalence that plastic has. It's an amazing material, and I can understand that there may be some very logical uses for it. But a straw, that we use for 2 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour at dinner, a plastic bottle that people, to drink water as they go from point A to point B. A plastic bag that's used on average of 12 minutes, from the grocery store to the house. It just doesn't make sense that we make these single-use disposable items out of a material that literally lasts forever. That disconnect does drive me, like you said. It just doesn't make sense. And as we are aware of this now, then we need to change our society about as a result of that, right? Like anybody, right? I mean, as you become aware of something, then you make changes in your course as a result of that new information.
Uh, I I think that yes, one does that if one is sane, which may be a whole nother discussion.
That may be.
So okay, so we've talked about your area of expertise. I want to come back to that in a minute. We've got about 10 minutes left,
Okay.
and I'm wondering if you can talk briefly about some of the other threats besides plastics and toxics to the Great Lakes, to the health of the Great Lake communities, natural communities.
Well, so I mean, we kind of touched on the fact that we have these algal blooms that really became prominent in the 60s and 70s, and then died away. And what happened was we realized that we were at that point in time, we didn't have wastewater treatment plants, at least not to the prevalence that we have them now. And so we were discharging basically lots of untreated human sewage, and that was leading to these algal blooms. And we put in all these wastewater treatment plants, and that solved the problem. Yay! But now we have a lot more agriculture in this area and a lot more fertilizer usage, and the runoff from all the fertilizer is making its way into the Great Lakes. And again, we have now these huge algal blooms, and it shut down, water in Cleveland for several days this past summer. They had no water, the residents of Cleveland, because the algal blooms were so bad that they couldn't, even after treatment, the drinking water wasn't drinkable. So algal blooms are a big one out here. Invasive species, whether we're talking plant species on land or fish species, like the Asian carp, is a really big one out here. And just kind of our industrial legacy, the one that has me, to be honest, most concerned, even just beyond the Great Lakes as a society, is the huge chemistry experiment that we have unintentionally incorporated our society in. Just the prevalence of synthetic chemicals within our society. We use something like 100,000 different synthetic chemicals, and less than 1% of them have ever been tested for human health impact. but they wash down the drain. They're in our water, wastewater, and water treatment plants weren't designed to remove these synthetic chemicals. So every drink of water that any human is taking on this planet comes with a whole mix of antidepressants and birth control and antibiotics, and I mean we just this whole like litany, pesticides and herbicides, of different synthetic chemicals, all in these very minute quantities. And that's, industry will always point to that. They'll always say, yeah, it's in there, but it's in such a small quantity, it doesn't make a difference. Well, yet that chemical's in there in a small quantity, and that chemical's in there in a small quantity, and that chemical's in there in a small quantity. But when you're talking about 100,000 different chemicals that are all present in very small quantities, it adds up to be something that is actually quite significant. And none of them, they haven't been tested by themselves, more or less synergistically. So when you have a bunch of different chemicals all present at the same time, what is the potential impact of that? And yet, while we don't know this, we see on a global scale, male sperm counts decreasing, increases in prostate cancer, increases in ovarian cancer, increases in breast cancer, increases in obesity in children under the ages of 6 months. This isn't because they're eating too much McDonald's and not going to the gym. And all of these things are connected to those synthetic chemicals. So that's one that has me, aside from global climate change, which is obviously probably the biggest environmental threat facing our society, I would say the next biggest are these synthetic chemicals. And it goes back to that very quote that you said, we shouldn't be making a poison that there is no antidote for. But that's basically what we've done. We've taken our planet and turned it into this great big chemistry experiment that nobody signed up for and nobody agreed to, and yet we're doing it on a daily basis and completely oblivious to the impact it's having on us, and completely oblivious to the fact that we don't have an antidote for it. And what are we going to do when all of our water is poisoned?
I just saw this great article not very long ago, this is maybe a month or two ago. The headline was, let me find this headline. This is just symptomatic of everything that's wrong with everything. The article is titled "Fracking or Drinking Water, That May Become the Choice." And the first sentence or two: fracking for oil and natural gas, or having enough water to drink. That's the possible dilemma facing a number of countries, including the United States. Although experts disagree on the real implications and what should be done about it. Seriously. Okay, water for fracking for oil and gas, or water to drink. That is a dilemma.
It's not.
And we disagree on the implications of what should be done about it. It's the same thing. It's just nuts.
Yeah, I know. That drives me crazy. I mean, fracking, New York just recently, the governor finally, after like a 6-year period, finally, he had this like 6-year moratorium where we weren't going to frack in New York State until we decided what to do. And he finally banned fracking in New York State, which, thank God. But, for 6 years, we've been having these discussions in our towns and our villages and our society here in New York State about whether we should be fracking. And it's hard because right next door in Ohio and Pennsylvania, they're fracking the hell out of their ground, and, we have people who live here and they see the boom towns building as a result of this fracking. But that's what gets me, is the water. Like, how do we rationalize taking clean drinking water, adding 500 different, bioaccumulative, toxic, carcinogenic, compounds to it, so that we can blast it into the ground at high pressure, and then some of that water comes back, and not only is it contaminated with those 500 different chemicals we added to it, but now it's got radioactive radioactive materials and heavy metals added to it to boot. And then basically we've done that. We've exchanged clean drinking water for natural gas. How do we rationalize that when we have the sun, pouring so much energy down that we're not making use of. But we feel the need to take and use the little bit of drinking water we have, clean drinking water, in order to get natural gas. I think this goes back to the sanity thing you mentioned a few minutes ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we have just a couple minutes left, and I think I have three fairly quick questions. One is, what do people, if people live around, what I'm trying to do with this whole series of radio interviews is to get people off their behinds and get them doing something.
Okay.
And the first question is, if somebody listens to this interview and they are concerned about plastics if they're concerned about all the issues you talked about, concerned about the Great Lakes in any way, concerned about plastics, concerned about toxins, apart from personal lifestyle stuff, which doesn't interest me quite so much, what do you want them to do? How can they actually affect some change?
Okay, aside from personal lifestyle, so aside from simply changing and being more knowledgeable about what you do in your everyday life,
Correct.
act. I've met, as a result of my work, for better or worse, I've met a lot of politicians, and we could talk in depth about that, but we won't. But I will simply say that a lot of them that I talk to, they really do respond to people, except they don't necessarily hear the right people. They have industry and lobbyists talking to them perpetually, every hour, every minute of every day. And so they need us, the little people, to be talking to them more, and nonstop. So every day writing letters, every day finding ways to get out and affect change and say, no, this isn't what I want. This isn't the society I want. I don't want this. I want something different. And you, as my representative, need to be acting on that. And not only talking to their politicians, but talking to their friends, and getting out there, acting, as you said, so beach cleanups, are they saving the world? Probably not, but they definitely help to raise a huge amount of awareness. And I think that that's important. The more that you can do to raise awareness to every single person and then hopefully that they'll continue that, and then that's how you affect change, right? It's that whole water drop and the ripple effect. So.
Okay, great. The second question of the three is, so if they made you queen of all things Great Lakes, and you can't get rid of capitalism entirely with this. You have to maintain the system. Unfortunately, you can get rid of capitalism in like 3 weeks or something.
Okay.
But at first, what would you do to help the Great Lakes? What policies would you want to see implemented immediately if you were the queen of all things Great Lakes?
I think the biggest thing is the regulation. I think we need to put into place what has been put into place in Canada and the European Union, and it's the precautionary principle. We cannot put chemicals on the marketplace unless they have been proven to not have an impact on humans and other living organisms. Not you put it out there, and if it has an impact, then maybe we'll take it off the marketplace, but you have to show that it's had an impact. That's our current system. Every chemical is allowed to be out there, and it's not until you can establish that it's had an impact that they might pull it off the marketplace. And showing that direct causal link is very difficult, even as a scientist. So I would prefer us change to the precautionary principle. So no chemicals are allowed to be on a store shelf unless they've been shown and proven to be safe. And regulation of fertilizer, we really have to change the way that we farm, that we grow our food. It's so important. The pesticides and the fertilizers and the herbicides, all of that, that has to change. So I'd start there. Start with the chemicals.
And I guess instead of my third question, I'll just mention that there's more than 450 dead zones in the oceans, and only one of them has actually disappeared. And the cool thing is that the one that disappeared, it's because when the Soviet Empire collapsed, they could no longer do industrial agriculture near the Black Sea at some places, and so the Black Sea dead zone actually recovered. And my point is just, once you take away that insult, it,
She was pretty good at cleaning herself out. I mean,
yeah.
she's been taking care of herself for billions of years, right? The planet has been here for 4.5 billion years. Nature is good. She knows how to take care of herself. It's the humans that need the education.
Well, and that actually, so that does bring me to the last question, which I'll come back and now do, which is, so if the Great Lakes could take on human manifestation, what do you think they'd do in terms of cleaning themselves? What would if the Great Lakes could jump into you, what would they say and do?
Um, I think that they would ask everybody to realize their beauty and to treat them with the respect, right? I mean, we walk around, I mean, as a society, we pay all this great tribute, right, to beautiful people. We give them awards, we put them on magazines, and yet we have something like the Great Lakes, which has such a majestic beauty. And what we've been doing to it is treating it like a landfill, treating it like a waste. We've um, so I think that's what it would I think it would want to personify itself as Beyonce and asked to be kind of given the same respect and recognition that somebody of that caliber would be given.
Well, thank you so much. And I would like to thank listeners for listening. My guest today has been Dr. Sherri Mason. This is Derrick Jensen for Resistance Radio on the Progressive Radio Network.